Hey guys, most of us picture a medieval house as a place of simple, flickering warmth. Stone walls, a roaring hearth, maybe a pot of stew bubbling away while everyone gathers close. But the deeper you look, the more you realize how much colder, smokier, and more relentlessly uncomfortable it actually was, and how much quiet ingenuity it took just to stay warm enough to survive the night. Where are you watching from tonight, and what piece of history would you like to drift off to next? If this kind of calm, thoughtful deep dive helps you unwind, a gentle like really does help the channel keep making them. And if you enjoy slipping into the past without any rush or hype, I hope you'll consider subscribing so more of these long, quiet histories find their way to you. Now, let's step through the threshold of an ordinary medieval house, somewhere in the English countryside, say around the year 1350, and feel for ourselves what it really meant to stay warm when the world outside had already gone dark and freezing. The first thing you notice is how small the windows are. Not the elegant arched glass of later centuries, but narrow slits or simple wooden shutters, often no larger than a man's hand. Glass was a luxury few could afford, and even when it existed it was thick, greenish, and expensive. Most homes simply left the openings uncovered during the day or closed them tight at night. Every extra inch of window meant another inch of cold air pouring in and another inch of precious heat escaping. The walls themselves, usually wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches plastered with mud, straw, and dung, offered surprisingly decent insulation when dry, but they cracked in winter, let drafts whistle through, and absorbed moisture like a sponge. Stone houses, more common among the better off, felt even colder because stone held the chill and radiated it back into the room long after the sun had set. At the center of the single main room, or sometimes slightly off to one side in later houses, sat the hearth. In the early Middle Ages, this was simply an open fire on the beaten earth floor, ringed by a few stones. Smoke rose straight up and eventually found its way out through a hole in the thatched roof called a louver, or simply through the thatch itself. The system was brutally inefficient. Much of the heat went straight up with the smoke, and on windy nights the smoke was driven back down, filling the room with a thick, eye-stinging haze that never quite cleared. People accepted this as normal. Chroniclers rarely complained about it because almost everyone lived the same way. Yet the smoke had one small mercy. It helped keep insects down and preserved meat and fish hung from the rafters. Still, by morning your clothes, your hair, and even the walls themselves carried the permanent scent of wood smoke. Fuel was another quiet daily battle. In wooded areas families burned whatever hardwood they could gather or buy. Oak, beech, ash, cut and dried for months. But by the 14th century, especially near growing towns, good timber had grown scarce and expensive. Many turned to peat, dug from bogs and stacked to dry, or to dried animal dung mixed with straw. These burned slower and gave less heat, but they were cheap and available. A careful householder learned exactly how much fuel the night would demand. Too little and the fire died before dawn, leaving the family to wake shivering under thin blankets. Too much and the risk of sparks catching the thatch became very real. Medieval villages burned to the ground with heartbreaking regularity. The fire was never allowed to go out completely. At night, the embers were banked with ashes and covered with a flat stone or a metal cover called a curfew, literally cover fire, to keep them alive until morning. The first task of the day, often done by the youngest child, was to kneel, blow gently on those embers, and coax the flames back to life. In the coldest months, this ritual happened before anyone else stirred, because without that small, living heart of warmth, the whole house felt like a tomb. Around the hearth, the family arranged their lives. There were no separate bedrooms in most cottages. Everyone slept in the same space. Beds were simple wooden frames or straw-filled sacks laid directly on raised platforms to escape the damp earthen floor. Heavy woolen curtains, when a household could afford them, were drawn around the bed at night, turning it into a small, shared cocoon that trapped body heat. Wealthier homes might hang tapestries on the walls, not for decoration alone, but because thick woven wool acted as a surprisingly effective barrier against drafts. Even so, people slept in their day clothes, often adding extra layers of cloaks and hoods. Children were tucked between adults, sharing warmth the way birds huddle on a branch. Clothing itself was the first and most portable defense against the cold. Men and women alike wore long wool tunics, sometimes lined with fur or padded with wool scraps. Linen undergarments wicked away sweat during the day but offered little insulation at night. Shoes were rarely removed indoors. The floor was cold and often muddy even inside. In the worst winters, people kept small braziers, portable metal pans filled with hot coals, near their feet while they worked or ate. These had to be watched constantly. A tipped brazier could ignite the rushes scattered on the floor in seconds. Meals were cooked directly on or beside the hearth. A large iron pot hung from a chain or rested on a trivet, simmering pottage. A thick stew of grains, root vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat or fish the household could spare. The pot itself radiated gentle heat long after the flames died down, and families learned to position themselves so that their backs absorbed the warmth while their fronts faced the fire. On especially bitter evenings, they might heat smooth river stones in the embers, wrap them in cloth, and carry them to bed like primitive hot water bottles. The practice was so common that some wills even mention my best warming stone as a small but treasured item. Yet the discomfort was constant and layered. Condensation formed on the inside of the walls. Damp straw bedding grew musty. Joints ached from the cold that settled in the bones after years of living this way. And always there was the knowledge that one bad frost or one failed harvest could turn mild inconvenience into genuine danger. Old people and the very young were most vulnerable. Parish records from the period quietly note higher mortality in long, hard winters when fuel ran short. Still, people adapted with a practicality that feels almost elegant in its simplicity. They chose the leeward side of hills for their villages. They planted quick-growing hedges as windbreaks. They kept animals inside during the worst weather, not only for their safety but because the collective body heat of cows, goats, and sheep added precious degrees to the single room. The smell was unpleasant, yet the warmth was undeniable. In some regions, this cohabitation was so normal that the word byre for a cowshed and the word for part of the house blurred together. As the 14th century wore on, a quiet revolution began in the homes of the gentry and richer merchants. Chimneys started to appear, first in stone manor houses, later in timber-framed town dwellings. The chimney drew smoke upward more efficiently, reduced the constant haze, and allowed fires to be built against a wall rather than in the center of the room. This single change meant the upper floor could finally be used for sleeping without choking on fumes. It also meant heat could be directed more precisely. But the new technology spread slowly. Building a proper chimney required skilled masons and cost far more than most peasant families would see in a lifetime. For the great majority, the old open hearth and the patient management of smoke remained the only reality they would ever know. Even with these small improvements, winter still tested every household. Nights grew longer, days shorter, and the fire became the undisputed center of existence. Stories were told around it, prayers were said beside it, arguments were settled by its light. Children learned their first lessons in responsibility by tending the embers. The rhythm of the fire dictated the rhythm of the day more surely than any church bell. And yet, for all its hardships, there was a kind of intimacy in that single shared warmth, an understanding that survival itself was a collective act. No one took the fire for granted. Every log placed on the hearth, every careful banking of coals at bedtime, carried the quiet knowledge that warmth was not a right but a daily achievement, earned and guarded together. We'll continue shortly with how this same struggle played out in the castles and great halls of the nobility. places that looked far grander from the outside but could be, in their own way, even colder and more unforgiving once the sun went down. The contrast between what visitors saw and what the people living there actually felt reveals something important about the medieval mind. The contrast between what visitors saw and what the people living there actually felt reveals something important about the medieval mind. Status was performed through scale and display, yet comfort remained a fragile, daily negotiation with the cold that no amount of wealth could entirely banish. Step inside a typical stone keep or manor house of the mid-14th century and the difference is immediate. The great hall stretches far larger than any peasant cottage, perhaps 30 or 40 feet long, with high timbered ceilings and narrow lancet windows set deep into walls 3 feet thick. From the outside these buildings looked impregnable and impressive, their towers and battlements promising shelter and power. Inside, however, the same stone that resisted enemy siege also refused to hold heat. On a winter evening the air near the floor stayed damp and chill even while the space above the hearth glowed with firelight. The central hearth here was no longer a simple ring of stones. It had often become a raised platform of brick or tile, sometimes with a hood or rudimentary canopy to guide smoke toward the roof louver. Yet the principle remained the same. An open fire whose warmth rose and vanished before it could truly warm the far corners of the hall. Noble households burned far more fuel than their tenants ever could. Whole cartloads of seasoned oak and beech arrived regularly from managed woodlands, and the Lord's forester was expected to ensure a steady supply. On feast days the fire might consume the equivalent of a small peasant family's monthly ration in a single evening, its flames leaping high enough to cast dancing shadows across the painted beams overhead. Servants worked in shifts to keep it roaring, turning great logs with iron pokers, raking embers, and carrying away ash in heavy baskets. The constant labor itself generated a little extra warmth, and the presence of 20 or 30 people in the hall added body heat that the open fire could never have managed alone. Still, the sheer volume of the space meant that anyone sitting more than 10 feet from the flames felt the cold pressing against their back. Drafts slipped between ill-fitting shutters and under heavy oak doors. The rushes on the floor, refreshed weekly with sweet herbs, still grew damp by morning and released a faint earthy smell that mingled with wood smoke. Wealth bought insulation of a different order. Thick wool tapestries, often imported from Flanders or woven locally with scenes of hunting and romance, hung from iron rods along the walls. They were not merely decorative. Each layer of dyed wool acted as a movable barrier, trapping pockets of warmer air against the stone and softening the constant downward flow of cold. In the best households these hangings were taken down in spring, beaten clean, and stored carefully so they would be ready again when the first frost arrived. Canopied beds appeared here too, but on a grander scale, four-poster frames draped with embroidered curtains of heavy worsted or even silk for the very richest. At night the lord and lady would retire to an upper chamber if the castle had one, or simply draw the curtains around a bed set in an alcove of the hall itself. Inside that fabric tent the temperature could rise 10 or 15 degrees simply from shared breath and blankets lined with marten or squirrel fur. Hot stones wrapped in linen still found their way between the sheets, passed up from the kitchen by a trusted page whose fingers were often numb by the time he reached the bedchamber. Even so, the nobility felt the seasons bite more sharply than modern imagination allows. Chroniclers occasionally let slip the reality. Fingers stiff around a quill, toes aching inside fur-lined boots, the constant low cough that came from breathing smoke-filled air night after night. Physicians of the period advised that the elderly and pregnant should stay within arm's length of the fire, and many a noblewoman gave birth in a chamber where braziers burned at each corner of the room, their coals replenished hourly by watchful attendants. Clothing followed the same layered logic as in the cottages, only richer. Men wore fur-trimmed houppelans, long, voluminous gowns, over wool doublets and linen shirts. Women layered kirtles and surcoats, their sleeves sometimes lined with miniver. Gloves were worn indoors on the coldest days, and hoods or chaperones stayed in place until the fire had been coaxed back to full strength each morning. The rhythm of warmth shaped the household's entire calendar. In autumn, the steward would order the annual woodcutting and the drying of peat or charcoal for the smaller rooms. By November, the castle's stores included barrels of salted herring, and smoked pork hung high in the rafters where the rising smoke helped preserve them. Candle-making became urgent work. Tallow dips and beeswax were kept close to the hearth so they would not snap in the cold. Even the horses in the stables received extra straw bedding, and grooms sometimes slept among them for mutual warmth, a practice that peasants and nobles alike understood without embarrassment. Yet the greatest irony lay in how little the grandest architecture actually improved daily comfort. A visitor arriving at dusk might be awed by torchlight flickering on polished armor and the roar of the hall fire, but those who lived there knew the truth. After the last course had been cleared and the trestle tables dismantled, the hall would cool rapidly. Servants would bank the fire, cover it with the curfew, and retire to their own cramped quarters above the kitchens or in the undercroft, where the residual heat from baking ovens offered a small mercy. The lord's family might retire to a solar, a private upper room with its own smaller fireplace, but even there the chimney, still a relatively new technology in many regions, sometimes drew poorly on windy nights, sending smoke curling back into the chamber. The very people who could afford glass windows often left them shuttered for weeks at a time, preferring darkness and stillness to the knife edge of cold air that would slice through the leaded panes. As the 14th century progressed, these small architectural shifts began to spread. Chimneys multiplied in the private chambers of the wealthy, allowing fires to be lit in more than one room at once. This in turn permitted a new kind of domestic privacy. The family no longer needed to huddle together in the single smoky hall. Yet the change came slowly and unevenly. Many lesser knights and prosperous merchants still lived in timber-framed halls that differed from peasant cottages mainly in size and the quality of the thatch. Their fires burned brighter, their tapestries were thicker, but the fundamental struggle against drafts, damp, and the relentless winter dark remained remarkably similar. One of the quietest adaptations occurred in the monasteries that dotted the countryside. There, the monks followed a rule that demanded they rise for the night office long before dawn, when the temperature inside the dormitory could drop near freezing. Stone cloisters and chapter houses were even less forgiving than castles, so the brethren relied on heavy woolen cowls, shared sleeping chambers, and a single warming room, known simply as the kale factory, where a fire was kept burning through the worst months. Novices learned early that the price of spiritual discipline included physical endurance. Frostbitten fingers during matins were not uncommon. Yet the very austerity of monastic life produced some of the most ingenious solutions. Underfloor heating in a few wealthier abbeys, where hot air from a furnace circulated through channels beneath the tiles, or the careful placement of scriptoria windows to catch the brief winter sun. What linked every level of society, from the thatched cottage to the stone solar, was the shared understanding that warmth was never guaranteed. It had to be tended, measured, and guarded. A single night of neglect could mean cracked pottery, spoiled stores, or worse, an infant lost to the cold that no hearth could fully defeat. People planned their lives around the fire's needs in ways that feel distant to us now. Yet the memory of those long winter evenings lingered in the language itself. The word curfew still carries its medieval echo of covering the fire. The phrase "to bank the fire" preserves the careful ritual of survival. And as we move forward into the later decades of the century, new pressures would test even these carefully balanced systems. Harvest failures, rising taxes, and the slow creep of enclosure laws began to change how fuel was gathered and who could afford it. The Black Death, when it swept through, left many houses empty and many fires untended for months at a time, allowing damp and decay to claim what the cold had not. Yet the survivors rebuilt, adapting old methods to new realities, and the quiet domestic science of staying warm continued its patient evolution, in the decades after the Black Death swept across England. The sudden shortage of labor brought subtle but meaningful shifts to how ordinary families approached the winter hearth. With fewer hands to till the fields and gather fuel, wages for those who remained rose sharply, and many peasant households found themselves able to afford a slightly better quality of wood or even the occasional sack of charcoal that once would have been reserved for the manor. Cottages that had stood empty were repaired with fresh wattle and daub, their walls packed more thickly this time in the hope of sealing out the damp that had claimed so many during the years of abandonment. The open hearth remained the unchallenged center of life, but now the careful management of smoke took on a new urgency. With smaller families and higher expectations of comfort, people began experimenting with simple smoke hoods fashioned from woven hurdles or clay daub, directing the worst of the fumes toward the roof louver more efficiently than before. It was not yet the enclosed chimney of the gentry, but it marked a quiet step forward, born not from grand architectural theory, but from the practical necessity of making limited resources stretch further in a world that felt emptier and colder than memory allowed. In the towns, where population decline had left rows of timber-framed houses vacant along the high streets, the survivors sometimes consolidated into larger dwellings. Here the advantages of shared walls became newly apparent. One household's hearth could warm the neighboring chamber through the thin partition, turning what had once been a solitary struggle into a modest communal benefit. Urban records from places like York and Norwich hint at this in their tax assessments. A merchant's widow might now occupy the upper floor of a building whose ground story housed a baker, the constant glow from his ovens rising through the floorboards like a gentle, unpaid blessing. Yet, even in these denser settings, the same old enemies persisted. The narrow streets funneled wind straight to the thresholds, and the thatched roofs, though skillfully maintained, still leaked smoke and occasional sparks when the winter gales howled down from the North Sea. Fuel sellers did brisk trade in bundles of faggots and sacks of sea coal, small, dusty lumps gathered from beaches or shallow mines in the northeast, that burned hotter than peat but left behind a sharper, more acrid smell that clung to woolen cloaks for days. Householders learned quickly that a careful mix of coal and would produce the best balance of heat and endurance, though the soot blackened the rafters faster and required more frequent sweeping to prevent chimney fires that could devour an entire row of buildings in minutes. Clothing, too, reflected the post-plague recalibration of daily life. With sheep flocks left untended and will suddenly cheaper, even modest households could line their tunics with an extra layer of fleece or stitch together patchwork blankets from salvaged garments of the dead. Children's bed sacks were stuffed more generously with straw and dried lavender, not only for scent, but because the herbs were believed to ward off the lingering vapors that physicians still feared might carry illness. The warming stone remained a trusted companion, but now some families kept 2 or 3, rotating them between the hearth and the bed in a small domestic ballet that occupied the last half hour before sleep. In the manor houses, the changes were more visible in the growing number of private chambers. Lords who had once entertained their entire retinue in the great hall now retreated earlier to solar rooms fitted with proper fireplaces and chimneys, their stone flues drawing smoke cleanly away and allowing the ladies of the household to embroider or read by candlelight without the constant sting in their eyes. These rooms, though still small by modern standards, felt luxurious precisely because the heat stayed where it was needed instead of vanishing into the cavernous roof space above. The monasteries, always laboratories of regulated living, refined their own techniques in response to the same demographic pressures. With fewer novices to share the dormitory chill, the kale factory fire was tended more attentively, its coals sometimes supplemented by iron braziers carried into the scriptorium so that the copyists could keep their fingers supple enough to form the delicate letters of illuminated manuscripts. Some abbeys experimented with rudimentary underfloor channels, laying clay pipes from the kitchen ovens to circulate warm air beneath the tiles of the warming room. The system was imperfect and prone to blockage, yet it demonstrated a growing understanding that comfort could be engineered rather than merely endured. Lay brothers who worked the abbey's outer granges carried the knowledge home with them when they visited family, whispering of these small innovations in the same hushed tones once reserved for relics and miracles. Throughout these years, the relationship between warmth and status grew more nuanced. A well-maintained hearth and a chimney that did not smoke were no longer merely practical. They became quiet markers of competence and foresight. A prosperous yeoman who could keep his house warm enough for his wife to spin wool late into the evening, without her hands stiffening, was admired in the village alehouse not for wealth alone but for the visible proof that he had mastered the unforgiving arithmetic of winter. Yet this mastery remained partial at best. Even the grandest households still woke to frost on the inside of the shutters, and the elderly continued to gather closest to the fire, their stools placed in the precise arc where the radiant heat could ease aching joints without scorching the hem of a gown. Physicians continued to prescribe, keeping the feet dry and the back to the fire. Advice that had changed little since the days of Hippocrates, but now carried the added weight of lived experience in a land still recovering from catastrophe. By the closing decades of the 14th century, another layer of adaptation appeared in the countryside. The slow enclosure of small plots and the planting of quick-growing hedges not only for livestock but as deliberate windbreaks. Families who had once accepted the full force of the prevailing winds now coaxed a few extra degrees of shelter from the landscape itself, their cottages nestling a little more snugly against the new green barriers. In the towns, the first glazed windows began to appear in the homes of the wealthiest merchants. Small diamond panes set in lead cames that admitted light while cutting the draft by half. The cost was still prohibitive for most, yet their presence signaled a future in which warmth might one day be separated from smoke and darkness. For the great majority, however, the old rhythms endured. The evening banking of the fire, the careful placement of the curfew, the first breath upon the embers at dawn, and the shared understanding that the household's survival still hinged on a single, living flame tended through the long hours of night. As England crossed into the 15th century, these incremental improvements began to accumulate in ways that would gradually reshape domestic life for those who could seize them. New building techniques, learned from returning soldiers and traveling masons, introduced better jointing in timber frames and more effective roof louvres that allowed smoke to escape without inviting rain. The wool trade, flourishing once more, put thicker blankets and lined cloaks within reach of a wider circle of families. Yet the fundamental challenge of the medieval house, its stubborn resistance to consistent, even warmth, remained a quiet teacher, reminding every generation that comfort was never a birthright but a craft passed down through small, patient acts of attention. And in the years ahead, as political unrest and changing agricultural patterns tested these hard-won balances once again, the quiet domestic science would be called upon to evolve further still. The opening decades of the 15th century brought fresh strains that reached straight into the hearthside routines of both cottage and manor. The lingering echoes of the Black Death had already thinned the countryside, but now the Wars of the Roses turned large stretches of England into contested ground. Armies on the march required fuel for their own encampments. Whole woodlands felled not for building but for the rapid kindling of watchfires and the baking of hard biscuit for thousands of men. Local households found their carefully coppiced groves suddenly claimed or burned, forcing them to rely more heavily on peat, gorse, or even the dried dung of their remaining livestock. In regions where fighting was fiercest, such as the Midlands and the North, the loss of timber meant that the evening banking of the fire became an exercise in stricter rationing. Families learned to judge the exact thickness of each log so that the embers would still glow at dawn without consuming an entire day's supply. Chroniclers noted, in passing, how the smoke from peasant fires grew thinner and sharper, carrying less of the sweet oak scent and more of the acrid bite of heather and scrub. Yet the same conflict that stripped resources also scattered skilled masons and carpenters across the kingdom as defeated lords rebuilt or fortified their holdings. These displaced craftsmen carried knowledge of chimney construction into villages that had never seen one, and in the quieter lulls between battles a surprising number of prosperous yeomen invested their modest wartime wages in a single stone flue rising from the gable end of their hall. This modest architectural upgrade, once confined to the gentry, began to trickle downward in ways that altered the very feel of domestic life. A chimney did more than carry smoke away. It allowed the fire to be placed against a wall, freeing the center of the room for tables, benches, and the small looms that many women now operated late into the evening. The air grew clearer, eyes less inflamed, and conversations around the hearth could last longer without the constant cough that had once punctuated every story. In some cottages, the change was so welcome that families slept closer to the new fireplace, arranging their bed platforms in a shallow arc that captured the steady radiant heat. The old central hearth did not vanish overnight. Many households kept it for cooking while the chimney served the main living space. But the division of labor between fire and smoke marked a gentle turning point. Wealthier farmers even began to experiment with small upper chambers, reached by a ladder or narrow stair, where a secondary brazier could be carried up at bedtime. The practice was still rare, yet it hinted at a future in which warmth might be distributed rather than pooled in one smoky heart. Agricultural shifts compounded these changes. The enclosure of common lands for sheep pasture, already underway before the wars, accelerated as lords sought reliable income from wool rather than uncertain grain rents. Hedges and quick-thorn barriers multiplied across the landscape, offering new windbreaks that sheltered both flocks and the cottages tucked behind them. Families who had once walked miles to gather firewood now found small stands of coppice deliberately planted along the edges of their holdings. The young shoots cut on a 7-year cycle and dried under cover for winter use. Peat-cutting rights, long jealously guarded, became objects of quiet negotiation in manorial courts. A tenant who could prove steady service might secure an extra strip of bog each season, enough to keep the fire alive through the longest nights. In the north and west, where coal outcrops lay close to the surface, the use of sea coal or pit coal crept inland along packhorse tracks. It burned with fierce, steady heat but produced a soot that blackened ceilings and lungs alike, so households mixed it sparingly with wood or dung, learning through trial which blend kept the iron pot simmering without choking the room. The practical knowledge accumulated in these small experiments passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, in the same matter-of-fact tone once reserved for the proper way to thatch a roof or salt a side of bacon. Inside the great halls of the nobility, the evolution was more pronounced yet still incomplete. By the mid-15th century, many castles and manor houses boasted multiple chimneys, each serving a private solar or withdrawing chamber. Tapestries grew heavier and more plentiful, their woolen weight now supplemented by occasional panels of embroidered leather or even early forms of wainscoting that lined the lower walls and trapped yet another layer of warmth. The Lord's physician might recommend a close chamber for the elderly or the expectant, a room kept continuously warm by a dedicated servant whose sole duty was to feed the fire and sweep the ash. Yet even here the cold retained its old authority. Stone floors still radiated chill upward, and on nights when the wind veered suddenly the new chimneys could draw too fiercely, pulling heat straight up the flue and leaving the room strangely empty of comfort. Servants continued to sleep in the great hall or in the undercroft, their bodies clustered for warmth much as they had in earlier generations, while the family above enjoyed the novelty of retiring without first drawing heavy curtains against the smoke. Monasteries, ever sensitive to the shifting world outside their walls, adapted with characteristic discipline. The kale factory remained the single sanctioned source of fire for most of the community, but now its coals were supplemented by iron stoves in the infirmary, where the sick could be nursed in genuine warmth for the first time in centuries. Copyists in the scriptorium benefited from small portable braziers placed beneath their desks, their ink less likely to freeze and their hands steadier for the long hours of illumination. Lay brothers who returned from market days brought news of town fashions. Glazed windows appearing in merchant houses, brick fireplaces replacing timber in the newer inns, and the abbots quietly weighed the cost of similar improvements against the rule of poverty. Some houses chose restraint. Others, especially those with rich endowments, began to rebuild their guest quarters with proper chimneys so that visiting pilgrims and benefactors would remember the abbey not only for its holiness but for the unexpected comfort of its fires. Across every level of society, the shared domestic science deepened its quiet authority. People still rose in the dark to coax the embers back to life, still wrapped warming stones in cloth and carried them to bed, still judged the quality of a neighbor's fire by the color of its smoke drifting above the thatch. But the balance was shifting, almost imperceptibly, toward a world in which warmth could be coaxed a little more reliably from the same stubborn materials. The political storms that had once threatened to extinguish the hearth altogether had, in their aftermath, scattered the seeds of small innovation. As the 15th century unfolded and the Tudor age began to cast its long shadow forward, these incremental gains in fuel management, building technique, and everyday ingenuity would be tested by new pressures: rising population, expanding trade, and the slow but steady arrival of coal as a domestic fuel in the towns. The medieval house, for all its apparent timelessness, was never truly static. It was a living negotiation between people and the cold, one that continued to evolve even as the world around it changed in ways no one inside those thick walls could yet fully imagine. Yet that imagined future, though still distant, began to materialize in tangible ways during the late 15th century as England stabilized under the early Tudor monarchs and the long shadow of civil war finally lifted. With peace came a modest surge in building and repair, and the quiet domestic science of warmth found new opportunities to refine itself. In the countryside, prosperous yeomen and lesser gentry, who had weathered the previous century's upheavals, now invested their accumulated savings in modest upgrades that would have seemed extravagant only a generation earlier. Timber-framed halls received proper chimneys of brick or stone, often built by itinerant masons who traveled the lanes offering their skills to anyone who could pay in wool or grain. These chimneys were not the grand, ornate stacks of later Tudor palaces but practical, functional flues that rose straight from the gable end, drawing smoke cleanly away and allowing the fire to be tucked against a wall without filling the entire space with haze. The difference was immediate and profound. The air inside grew lighter, conversation flowed more easily, and the constant low-level irritation in the eyes and throat that had defined so many winter evenings began to recede for those fortunate enough to afford the change. Fuel itself reflected the shifting landscape of the late medieval countryside. Coppiced woodlands, carefully managed for decades, now supplied a more reliable harvest of poles and faggots, while the enclosure of marginal lands for pasture meant that sheep dung, dried and mixed with straw, remained a dependable, if humble, alternative in districts where timber was scarce. In the southeast, where the Thames carried barges laden with sea coal from Newcastle, the black lumps began to appear in the hearths of merchants and prosperous artisans with increasing frequency. It burned with a fierce, steady heat that outlasted wood and required less constant tending, though it left behind a fine, oily soot that clung to rafters and demanded regular sweeping to prevent the dangerous buildup that could ignite without warning. Householders learned to blend it judiciously with drier kindling, discovering through patient trial that a bed of coal topped with a layer of oak produced the ideal combination of endurance and controllable flame. The practice spread slowly inland along river routes and drover roads, carrying with it a subtle shift in the very scent of winter. The sweet, resinous tang of wood smoke giving way, in some districts, to the sharper, mineral bite of coal. Clothing adapted in parallel with these hearthside improvements. The heavier woolens of the earlier period were supplemented by new weaves influenced by Flemish and Italian trade, their tighter nap trapping body heat more effectively against the skin. Doublets and kirtles were lined with lamb's wool or rabbit fur for those who could manage it, while even modest households patched and layered garments with greater care, turning worn tunics into quilted undergarments that could be worn night and day during the coldest months. Bedding grew marginally more generous. Straw mattresses were topped with feather beds in the better cottages, and the old practice of sharing warmth between adults and children took on a new layer of intentionality as families arranged themselves to maximize the collective heat beneath thicker coverlets. Warming stones remained a staple, but now some households kept small iron boxes filled with hot sand or embers that could be slid beneath the bed frame, radiating gentle warmth for hours without the risk of scorching linen. The evening ritual of banking the fire took on a slightly different character too. With a chimney to contain the blaze, the curfew stone could be set more precisely, preserving embers that glowed brighter and longer into the pre-dawn hours. In the towns, the transformation was more visible and more rapid. London's growing population and expanding trade brought not only coal but also the first widespread use of brick for chimneys and even entire house fronts in the wealthier wards. These brick structures held heat differently from stone or daub, retaining warmth longer once the fire was established and releasing it more evenly through the night. Narrow town houses, built shoulder to shoulder along crowded streets, benefited from shared party walls that acted as natural insulators, turning what had once been a liability of urban density into a modest advantage against the cold. Yet the same density brought new challenges. Smoke from dozens of chimneys pooled in the narrow alleys, and on still winter nights the air grew thick enough that householders sometimes left upper windows cracked open despite the draft, preferring a breath of fresher air to the accumulated soot. Bakers and brewers, whose ovens and coppers generated surplus heat, found their premises in higher demand as neighbors sought permission to warm their hands or dry damp cloaks against the outer walls. A small but telling sign of how warmth had become a negotiable commodity even in the heart of the city. The great houses of the nobility reflected these changes on a grander scale while still preserving the essential medieval outline. Many older castles were modernized with ranges of private chambers, each fitted with its own fireplace and chimney, allowing the family to withdraw from the great hall earlier in the evening and sleep in rooms that stayed tolerably warm until morning. Tapestries gave way in some households to early paneling of oak or imported walnut, their tight joints and polished surfaces reflecting heat back into the chamber with surprising efficiency. Servants continued to cluster around the hall fire or in the kitchens, but the division between master and servant spaces grew more pronounced, even as the practical realities of winter reminded everyone that the cold cared little for rank. Physicians attached to noble households now routinely advised on the placement of braziers and the ventilation of new chimneys, blending classical learning with the hard-won experience of recent decades. The result was a domestic environment that felt incrementally more humane, yet the underlying dependence on fire, fuel, and careful husbandry remained unchanged. Even the monasteries, facing their own quiet pressures before the storms of the Reformation, refined their communal approach to warmth. The kale factory in many houses received upgraded stoves or better ventilated hearths, and the infirmary became a sanctuary where the elderly and ailing could be kept in genuine comfort for the first time. Novices learned not only the spiritual discipline of rising for matins in freezing darkness but also the practical craft of tending multiple fires without waste, knowledge they sometimes carried with them when they returned to lay life or when the abbey itself hosted travelers seeking shelter. The scriptoria, once chilled and cramped, benefited from small iron grates that allowed copyists to work with steadier hands, preserving the illuminated manuscripts that would later survive the upheavals to come. Across the kingdom, these small, cumulative adaptations created a patchwork of comfort that varied by region, by status, and by the fortunes of the harvest. A yeoman's cottage in Kent with its new brick chimney and coal supplement felt markedly different on a January night from a moorland dwelling in Yorkshire that still relied on peat and shared animal warmth. Yet the common thread endured. Warmth was never assumed, never taken for granted. It remained a daily achievement, measured in logs and embers, in the careful placement of a stool or the timely banking of coals. As the 16th century gathered pace and the Tudor court began to reshape the kingdom's economy and faith, these domestic negotiations would be drawn into larger currents. Rising population, expanding trade in textiles and fuel, and the slow but steady encroachment of new building fashions that promised even greater control over the cold. The medieval house, shaped by centuries of patient ingenuity, stood on the threshold of changes that would alter its very bones. Yet the fundamental human task of coaxing life from a single flame in the long winter dark would continue to define the rhythm of ordinary existence in ways that no royal decree or architectural blueprint could entirely erase. Henry VII's reign brought a fragile peace that encouraged modest rebuilding across the realm, and in the countryside the pace of domestic improvement quickened almost imperceptibly. Yeomen who had accumulated a few extra acres through careful marriage or service to the crown now replaced sagging thatch with fresh reed or straw, and many added a second chimney stacked to a gable end that had stood bare for generations. The new flues were built of local brick where it could be afforded, or of rough stone bonded with lime mortar, their narrow throats drawing smoke upward with a low, steady murmur that replaced the old chaotic billowing through the roof louver. Inside, the air cleared enough that families could hang herbs and onions from the rafters without fear of them blackening overnight, and the faint scent of wood smoke that once permeated every garment gave way, in these upgraded homes, to something closer to the clean smell of dried rushes and lavender. Yet for every cottage that gained a chimney, dozens remained as they had always been, single-room halls with open hearths, their smoke still curling lazily toward the thatch and their walls still patched each spring with fresh daub to seal out the drafts that crept in with the first hard frost. Fuel supplies reflected the slow but steady growth of trade and enclosure. In the southeast, coal barges from the Tyne and Wear began to nose their way up the Thames in greater numbers, and enterprising carters distributed the black lumps along the Great North Road and into the Midlands. A household that once budgeted every faggot now learned to layer sea coal beneath a cap of seasoned oak, discovering that the combination produced a hotter, more sustained burn that could warm a larger space without constant prodding. The practice carried its own quiet risks. The denser smoke was more acrid, and the soot accumulated faster in the new chimneys, requiring a boy to climb the stack once or twice a winter with a weighted brush to prevent the dangerous buildup that could ignite and send flames licking across the roof. In the north and west, where coal lay closer to the surface, peat remained king, cut in long strips from the mosses and stacked to dry in the brief summer sun. Families still judged the quality of a winter's supply by the weight and color of each slab, knowing that a well-cured block would smolder through the night and leave behind a fine white ash that could be scattered on icy paths or mixed into the garden soil come spring. Clothing evolved in tandem with these hearthside refinements. The Tudor silhouette, closer-fitting doublets for men, fuller skirts and separate bodices for women, demanded new ways of layering against the cold. Linen shirts were worn next to the skin to wick away moisture, topped by woolen kirtles or jerkins padded with wool scraps or even horsehair in the colder districts. Wealthier households lined sleeves and hems with squirrel or fox fur, while poorer families relied on patched wool and the shared warmth of bodies huddled beneath a single heavy coverlet. Bedding itself grew more structured. Straw pallets were often raised on low wooden frames to escape the damp earth, and the old practice of tucking hot stones or bricks into the bed gained a small refinement. Some households fashioned simple wooden boxes lined with cloth to hold the warmth longer and prevent accidental burns. The evening ritual of banking the fire remained unchanged in its essentials. Embers raked together, covered with the curfew, and left to glow gently until the first stirring at dawn, when the youngest child or the servant girl would kneel, blow softly, and coax the new day's flame into being. In the towns the transformation was more dramatic, though still uneven. London streets, crowded with half-timbered houses leaning toward one another like old friends, now sprouted forests of brick chimneys that rose above the rooftops in testimony to the growing availability of coal and the skills of Flemish bricklayers who had crossed the channel in search of work. These chimneys allowed upper rooms to be heated independently, turning what had once been storage lofts into modest bedchambers where merchants and their wives could retire without first drawing curtains against the smoke. Yet the very density that made shared walls an asset also concentrated the smoke from hundreds of fires, and on windless evenings the air in the narrower alleys grew thick enough that householders sometimes complained of sore throats and stinging eyes even inside their own parlors. Bakers and brewers continued to offer their surplus warmth to neighbors, and public bathhouses, though fewer than in earlier centuries, still provided a rare evening of genuine heat for those who could spare the penny. The contrast between the warm, well-lit interiors of the prosperous and the chill, smoky rooms of the laboring poor remained as stark as ever, a reminder that comfort was still a privilege measured in fuel and the labor required to keep it burning. Among the nobility, the great houses of the early Tudor period blended old medieval forms with new Renaissance influences. Long galleries and private withdrawing chambers multiplied, each fitted with ornate fireplaces whose carved stone surrounds and polished andirons spoke of status as much as utility. Tapestries gave way to paneling in the newest fashion, the oak wainscot rising halfway up the walls and trapping pockets of warm air that made the rooms feel more intimate even on the coldest nights. Servants still slept in the great hall or in the attics above the kitchens, their bodies clustered for warmth much as they had in the time of the Plantagenets, while the family enjoyed the novelty of retiring to chambers that stayed tolerably warm until morning. Yet even here the old vulnerabilities persisted. A sudden shift in wind could reverse the draft in a poorly designed flue, sending smoke billowing back into the room and forcing everyone to open windows despite the freezing air outside. Physicians attached to noble households advised on the placement of braziers and the careful ventilation of new chimneys, their recommendations blending classical learning with the practical experience of recent decades. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII brought its own quiet disruptions to the domestic landscape. Many former abbey buildings were granted to courtiers who converted the stone cloisters and chapter houses into private dwellings, their thick walls and underfloor heating channels, where they survived, offering an unexpected legacy of medieval ingenuity to a new generation of owners. The kale factories and infirmaries, once regulated by monastic rule, now served as model warming rooms in secular homes, their fires tended not by novices but by household servants who carried the knowledge of steady, efficient burning into the wider world. Lay brothers and former monks, scattered across the countryside, sometimes found employment as stewards or masons, quietly passing on the small techniques they had perfected in the years of communal living. The precise angle of a flue, the best mix of fuel for a slow overnight burn, the placement of a bed to capture every degree of radiant heat. By the middle decades of the 16th century, these incremental gains had created a patchwork of comfort that varied sharply by region, by rank, and by the fortunes of the harvest or the wool trade. A prosperous clothier's house in Suffolk, with its brick chimneys and coal fires, felt worlds away from a moorland croft in Cumberland where peat and shared animal warmth remained the only defense against the wind that swept down from the fells. Yet the common thread endured. Warmth was still a daily negotiation, measured in logs and embers, in the careful placement of a stool or the timely banking of coals. The Tudor court itself, with its growing taste for Italian and French fashions, began to import new ideas about domestic architecture, larger windows, more efficient fireplaces, even the first experiments with early forms of glass that admitted light without inviting quite so much cold. These innovations would slowly filter downward, but for the great majority of English households the medieval inheritance of open hearths, thatched roofs, and patient fire-tending continued to shape the long winter nights in ways that no royal proclamation or fashionable blueprint could fully displace. And as the century wore on and new pressures, rising population, religious upheaval, and the slow expansion of coal mining began to reshape the kingdom once more, the quiet domestic science of staying warm would be called upon to adapt again, carrying forward the patient ingenuity of generations who had learned, through frost and firelight, exactly what it took to keep a single flame alive until morning. The transition from Elizabeth's reign into that of James I brought new pressures of population growth and expanding commerce that reached directly into the hearths of both town and country. With more mouths to feed and more bodies to warm, the demand for fuel intensified, and the careful balance that had sustained households for centuries began to tilt toward coal in ways that would reshape the very atmosphere of winter evenings. In London and the larger provincial towns, the Black Sea coal from the northeast now arrived not in occasional barges but in regular fleets, its price falling just enough that even a skilled artisan could afford a weekly sack to supplement his wood. Householders learned to build the fire with a base of coal, its dense heat radiating steadily outward, then cap it with drier oak or ash that flared briefly to chase away the sharper mineral scent. The new chimneys, many of them now built taller and with better drafted throats, carried the smoke high above the rooftops. Yet on still, foggy nights the combined exhalations of thousands of fires still settled over the streets like a low, acrid blanket. Inside the better sort of timber-framed house, the air grew noticeably warmer and drier. Families could sit a little farther from the flames without feeling the old familiar chill at their backs, and the once ubiquitous cough that had accompanied every long winter began to recede for those lucky enough to live behind a proper flue. In the countryside the shift was slower but no less significant. Yeomen and tenant farmers whose holdings had grown through enclosure or favorable leases invested in brick chimneys and, where local clay allowed, in simple tile floors that held heat longer than beaten earth. The old central hearth lingered in many cottages, valued for its generous cooking space and the way its open light filled the single room. Yet an increasing number of households added a second, smaller fireplace in a partition chamber at the gable end. This modest division allowed the family to retire to a space that stayed warm well into the night without the constant draft that had once whistled across the main hall. Fuel gathering took on new rhythms. Coppiced woodlands were harvested more systematically, their young poles cut on stricter cycles, while peat turfs were stacked higher and covered with hurdles to dry more thoroughly. In districts near the coast or navigable rivers, coal began its quiet inland march, carried on the backs of pack ponies or in the panniers of farmers returning from market. The blending of fuels became an art passed quietly from one generation to the next. Too much coal and the room filled with a throat-catching haze. Too little and the fire died before the longest hours had passed. Clothing and bedding reflected these incremental gains in domestic warmth. Woolen fabrics from the booming cloth trade grew finer and more tightly woven, their nap trapping body heat with greater efficiency. Men's doublets and women's petticoats were lined with fustian or flannel, and even modest households could afford a second layer of stockings or mittens knitted from homespun yarn. The bed, once a simple straw pallet on the floor, was more often raised on a low frame of turned oak, its mattress topped with a featherbed or a thick flock of wool for those who could manage the expense. Warming devices grew subtly more sophisticated. Iron boxes filled with hot sand replaced the old river stones in some homes, their lids fitted with small vents that released gentle heat without the risk of scorching linen. At bedtime the ritual remained reassuringly familiar. Embers banked, curfew set, perhaps a final hot brick wrapped in flannel and slipped beneath the coverlet. But now the shared warmth of the household felt less like a desperate huddle and more like a deliberate arrangement, each body positioned to capture every available degree from fire, wall, and one another. Yet the very improvements that eased the bite of winter also introduced new vulnerabilities. Brick chimneys, while efficient, were expensive to repair when frost cracked their mortar, and a poorly maintained flue could fill a room with invisible, deadly gases that no one yet fully understood. The increased use of coal produced finer soot that clung to rafters and occasionally ignited with terrifying speed, sending panicked families into the night with buckets of water and wet sacks. In the towns where houses stood shoulder to shoulder, one household's chimney fire could threaten an entire row, prompting civic authorities to issue ordinances requiring regular sweeping and the keeping of leather buckets filled with sand. Rural cottages faced their own quiet hazards. A thatched roof, though skillfully laid, could smolder for hours if a stray spark from the hearth found its way upward, and many a family learned to keep a long pole with a wet cloth ready beside the door. The cold itself, though less absolute, still tested the very young and the very old. Parish registers continued to note higher mortality in hard winters, a reminder that comfort remained partial and conditional. Among the gentry and minor nobility, the great houses of the early Stuart period displayed these changes on a more generous scale. Long galleries, once built for exercise and display, were now lined with paneling and fitted with multiple fireplaces whose carved surrounds and polished andirons reflected both status and the practical desire for even warmth. Private bedchambers multiplied, each with its own hearth, allowing the family to retire earlier and sleep without the constant murmur of servants tending the great hall fire below. Tapestries hung less frequently, replaced by oak wainscot or imported hangings of silk and wool that trapped heat more effectively, while adding a note of color to the winter gloom. Servants still clustered around the kitchen fire or in the attics, their shared body heat a familiar comfort. Yet the division between the warm private rooms of the family and the chillier service quarters had grown more pronounced. Physicians continued to advise on the placement of braziers and the careful management of drafts, their prescriptions now informed by a growing body of observation about the effects of smoke and damp on the humors. The religious and political upheavals of the mid-17th century would soon test these hard-won balances once more. Civil war again scattered armies across the land, consuming timber for campfires and disrupting the steady flow of coal from the northeast. Households that had come to rely on a regular supply found themselves reverting to peat and dung, their chimneys standing cold and empty, while families huddled closer to the old open hearths they had only recently begun to abandon. Yet, even in the midst of conflict, the accumulated knowledge of generations proved resilient. Masons and carpenters, displaced by the fighting, carried techniques of chimney construction into new regions, and the very necessity of survival sharpened the old domestic arts. When peace returned under the Commonwealth and later the Restoration, the surviving households set about repairing and improving with a quiet determination born of experience. New building fashions, taller windows with more glass, brick fronts replacing timber in the smarter streets, and fireplaces designed to draw more cleanly, began to spread, promising a future in which warmth might be distributed more evenly and with less labor. Across the kingdom, the pattern remained one of patient, uneven progress. A merchant's house in Bristol with its coal-fired range and glazed casements felt markedly different on a January night from a moorland farmstead in Durham, where peat still smoldered under a thatched roof and the family shared warmth with their livestock. Yet the common inheritance endured. The evening banking of the fire, the careful placement of stools in the arc of greatest heat, the shared understanding that comfort was never guaranteed but had to be coaxed, guarded, and passed on. As the 17th century advanced and the Stuart age gave way to new political and commercial realities, these small domestic negotiations would be drawn into larger currents once again. Expanding coal mining, improved transport, and the slow arrival of architectural ideas from the continent that spoke of greater control over the elements. The medieval house, though transformed in countless subtle ways, still carried within its thick walls and familiar routines the living memory of generations who had learned, through frost and firelight, the precise measure of warmth required to see a family safely through until dawn. By the closing years of the 17th century and into the early decades of the 18th, that inherited knowledge found itself quietly reshaped by the widening reach of coal and the first stirrings of a more systematic approach to domestic comfort. The expanding coal trade, fueled by deeper mines in Northumberland and Durham and by the reliable coastal colliers that plied the East Coast, brought the black fuel into ordinary households at prices that made it practical for a growing number of middling families. In London and the southern counties, the evening fire was no longer built on a simple hearthstone but within an iron basket grate set into a recessed fireplace, its bars allowing air to circulate beneath the coals and produce a steadier, more intense heat than wood alone could manage. The grate itself became a small domestic investment. A well-made one could last a generation, and households learned to bank the coals at night by drawing the bars closer together and covering the top with a thin layer of ash, preserving enough live heat to rekindle the blaze before the household stirred at dawn. The scent of the room changed accordingly, less of the sweet resin of oak, more of the clean mineral bite of coal. Yet the smoke, now drawn cleanly up taller chimneys of brick or stone, left the air inside noticeably clearer than it had been in the days of open louvres and thatched roofs. In the countryside, the adoption was patchier, dictated by distance from navigable water and the stubborn loyalty to local fuels. A yeoman in Kent might mix sea coal with coppiced beech, enjoying the longer burn while still using the old central hearth for cooking the midday pottage. Further north, in Yorkshire or Lancashire, peat remained the staple for many upland farms, cut in spring and stacked to weather through the summer so that by November each turf would smolder with a low, steady glow that required almost no tending once the fire was properly laid. Families continued to arrange their evenings around the fire's needs. The women spinning or mending by its light, the men carving or repairing tools, the children learning their letters or simply huddling close for warmth. The bed, now more often a proper wooden frame with rope supports, stood in a corner or small partition chamber, its curtains drawn not merely against drafts but to capture the rising heat that lingered after the main fire had been banked. Hot bricks or iron boxes filled with sand still traveled from hearth to bed. Yet in homes with the new grates the warmth radiated more evenly, allowing sleepers to lie a little farther apart without feeling the old, bone-deep chill settle between them. These incremental comforts carried their own quiet ironies. Coal burned hotter and longer, yet it produced a finer soot that clung to ceilings and required more frequent chimney sweeping, work often done by small boys who scrambled up the narrow flues with brushes and scrapers, their labor a reminder that progress always exacted a price from the most vulnerable. In towns, the combined smoke of thousands of coal fires created a low-hanging haze that smarted the eyes on windless days, and physicians began to note, in careful Latin, the prevalence of respiratory complaints among those who lived year-round in the narrower streets. The very efficiency of the new fireplaces sometimes encouraged larger rooms. Merchants and prosperous tradesmen built parlors and withdrawing chambers that could be heated separately, yet the stone or brick walls still radiated cold from the outside, and on bitter nights servants still carried braziers from room to room or clustered together in the kitchen where the constant baking and boiling added their own generous warmth. Architectural fashions arriving from the continent and from the newly fashionable squares of London further refined the domestic landscape. Georgian houses, rising in brick with symmetrical sash windows and paneled interiors, incorporated fireplaces designed to reflect heat forward into the room rather than simply draw it upward. Firebacks of cast iron, often decorated with coats of arms or simple classical motifs, threw additional warmth toward the occupants, and the careful placement of fenders and andirons kept sparks safely contained. Shutters, once simple wooden boards, became more finely fitted, and in the better houses double glazing or heavy curtains helped seal the drafts that sash windows, for all their elegance, still admitted. Yet even in these refined dwellings the fundamental reliance on fire remained absolute. A household that let its coals go cold overnight faced the same laborious rekindling that a medieval cottager had known. The careful arrangement of kindling, the gentle blowing on embers, the patient coaxing until the new day's flame caught and spread. Across the social spectrum, the rhythms of winter life still revolved around fuel and flame. In the great country houses of the early Hanoverian period, the staterooms might boast marble chimney-pieces and elaborate grates. Yet the servants' quarters and the upper attics often relied on the older, simpler hearths whose warmth had to be carefully shared. The lady of the house might retire to a private closet warmed by a small coal fire, her maid warming her clothes before the grate each morning, while downstairs the kitchen staff kept the great range roaring from before dawn until well after dusk, its ovens and boilers providing both meals and a steady background heat that made the basement regions surprisingly tolerable even in January. The contrast between the polished, firelit elegance of the drawing room and the chill of the unheated passages and staircases remained a daily fact of life, accepted with the same practical resignation that earlier generations had shown toward smoke-filled halls. Regional differences continued to color the experience in vivid ways. In the coal-rich north, the fire was often a generous, open range that could accommodate both cooking and warmth without competition. In the wood-scarce southeast, the careful husbanding of every lump became a domestic art taught to daughters alongside bread-making and linen washing. In Scotland and the border counties, where the climate bit harder, box beds built into the walls offered an extra layer of insulation, their heavy curtains and built-in shelves for hot stones turning each sleeping alcove into a miniature cocoon. Everywhere the old collective wisdom persisted. The placement of furniture to shield against drafts, the layering of clothing that could be added or shed as the fire rose or fell, the shared understanding that warmth was not a background condition but a living presence that required constant, thoughtful attention. As the 18th century advanced and the first tremors of industrial change began to ripple through the countryside, new turnpike roads speeding the delivery of coal, enclosure reshaping the supply of wood and peat, population growth increasing the sheer number of fires burning across the island, the quiet domestic science continued its patient evolution. Improved grates and better chimney design allowed heat to be coaxed more efficiently from the same fuels. Yet the fundamental challenge of the English winter refused to yield entirely. Frost still formed on the inside of window panes in unheated rooms, joints still ached after years of exposure to damp and cold, and the very young and the very old still gathered closest to the hearth as they always had. The living memory of earlier generations, preserved in the careful banking of coals and the precise arrangement of a stool within the fire's radiant arc, found itself quietly enriched by new materials and new techniques, yet it remained unmistakably the same inheritance. A hard-won knowledge that comfort in the long winter dark was never guaranteed, only achieved through daily care and the shared labor of keeping one steady flame alive until morning. And as the century moved deeper into its middle decades, with new agricultural improvements and the slow spread of manufacturing, those same households would face fresh tests and fresh opportunities. Rising coal production bringing both abundance and new forms of soot, architectural fashions promising even greater control over drafts and damp, and the first tentative experiments with stoves and closed ranges that hinted at a future in which warmth might finally be distributed more evenly. Throughout the house, the medieval inheritance, transformed and yet strangely intact, stood ready to meet those changes in the only way it ever had, one careful, firelit evening at a time. As the 18th century deepened and the early tremors of industrial life began to ripple outward from the mills and mines, the familiar rhythms of hearth and home absorbed new materials and new expectations without ever quite surrendering their older wisdom. In the growing towns of the Midlands and the North, where coal pits multiplied and turnpike roads carried the black fuel southward at an accelerating pace, the iron grate became the quiet centerpiece of many parlors. No longer the simple basket of earlier decades, these grates were cast with precise bars that allowed air to flow beneath the coals, feeding a steadier, more intense burn that could warm a room for hours with less constant attention. Householders learned to layer the fire with a base of larger lumps for endurance and a topping of smaller cinders or slack that caught quickly and held the heat close, banking it at night with a wrought iron cover or a thick layer of ash drawn forward by a poker. The result was a gentler, more even warmth that reached farther into the corners than the old open hearths ever had. Yet the room still carried the faint mineral tang that marked the shift from wood and peat. Families arranged their evenings much as their grandparents had, gathered in the arc of greatest heat, the women mending by the glow, the men reading or carving, the children tucked on low stools with their feet toward the bars. But now the fire demanded less fuel overall, freeing a little more time for conversation or quiet reflection before the curfew was set. In the countryside, the inheritance showed itself more stubbornly. Many farmhouses still favored the broad open hearth for its generous space and the way its light filled the kitchen where the family spent most of its waking hours. Peat and coppice would remain the daily companions there, supplemented only when a cart from the nearest colliery arrived with a precious load of sea coal. The new Rumford fireplace, designed by the American-born Count Rumford and slowly adopted in more progressive homes after the 1790s, offered a subtle but meaningful improvement even in these rural settings. Its angled fireback and narrowed throat reflected heat forward into the room while drawing smoke away more efficiently, reducing the old haze that had once stung the eyes. A yeoman who installed one found that he could sit a few feet farther back without feeling the chill creep across his shoulders, and the kitchen range, sometimes fitted with a small oven beside the main grate, allowed bread to bake while the family ate, turning the hearth into a more versatile servant. Yet the old domestic arts persisted alongside these refinements. Bed curtains, heavier now with the wider availability of woolen stuffs from the mills, were drawn tight at night to trap the warmth that rose from a hot brick slipped beneath the mattress. Servants and children still carried warming pans or iron boxes filled with coals from room to room, their paths traced by the soft clink of metal on stone flags. Frost still etched patterns on the inside of single-glazed windows, and the passageways between rooms remained cold enough that a quick dash from parlor to bedchamber required an extra shawl or cloak. The expanding reach of coal brought its own layered ironies. In London and the industrial towns, the smoke from countless grates thickened the winter air into the famous yellow fogs that physicians were beginning to link with persistent coughs and labored breathing. Families who could afford it chose coal not only for its heat but for its convenience. A single delivery could last a week where wood or peat might demand daily gathering or cutting. Yet the finer soot clung to ceilings and furniture, requiring more frequent sweeping and occasional whitewashing of the walls to keep the rooms from looking perpetually dim. In the better Georgian townhouses, the fireplaces were built shallower and with polished marble surrounds that reflected light and heat alike, while high-backed wing chairs positioned near the grate created a small pocket of comfort where an elderly relative could sit for hours without the cold seeping into aching joints. The kitchen, often the warmest space in the house, drew the household together after supper, its range or open hearth providing both heat and the steady simmer of soup or porridge that would see them through until morning. Servants slept in attics or basements where residual warmth from the day's baking lingered, their bodies clustered much as medieval servants had once clustered in the great hall, sharing the collective heat that no single fire could distribute evenly across an entire dwelling. Architectural fashions of the period continued to refine the medieval outline without erasing it. Sash windows, taller and more finely fitted than earlier casements, still admitted drafts around their frames, so householders stuffed rags or slips of wood into the gaps and relied on heavy velvet or wool curtains to seal the rooms at dusk. In the grander country houses, the state apartments boasted multiple grates, each tended by a footman who knew exactly how to build the fire for maximum reflection and minimum smoke. Yet the passages and staircases between them remained chill, a reminder that warmth was still concentrated rather than universal. Physicians advised the elderly and the infirm to keep within the immediate radius of a good fire, echoing advice that had changed little since the 14th century, while mothers tucked extra flannel around infants and kept a brazier glowing softly in the nursery through the longest nights. The very abundance of coal in some districts encouraged larger rooms and higher ceilings, yet those same spaces demanded more careful management to prevent the heat from simply rising and vanishing up the flue. Families learned to live in layers, drawing closer to the grate as the evening deepened, then retreating to curtained beds where shared breath and stored warmth from the day's fire offered a final defense against the dark. Regional variations remained as vivid as ever. In the coal-rich north, the grate was often a generous affair that could accommodate both cooking pots and a kettle for endless tea, its heat shared freely with neighbors who dropped in on winter evenings. Further south and west, where wood and peat were still more affordable, the older open hearth lingered, its smoke curling toward a chimney that had been raised and improved over generations but whose essential purpose had not changed. Scotland and the border counties clung to their box beds and peat fires, the heavy curtains and built-in stone shelves for hot stones turning each sleeping nook into a private sanctuary against the sharper Highland winds. Everywhere the evening banking ritual endured, adapted but recognizable. Coals raked together, ash drawn over them, the grate closed or the curfew set so that a core of live heat would survive until the first stirring at dawn. Children still learned to coax the embers back to life with gentle breath and dry kindling, the same small domestic sacrament that had once been performed in wattle and daub cottages centuries earlier. As the century turned toward the 1800s and the full force of industrial expansion began to reshape both landscape and daily routine, These accumulated refinements stood poised to meet yet another wave of change. New turnpike roads and soon, the first canals carried coal farther and cheaper than ever before, while the mills that spun cotton and wove will also produce textiles that made layering against the cold both easier and more varied. The medieval house, now dressed in Georgian brick or Regency stucco, still warmed itself at the heart of a living fire tended with the same patient attention. Yet the pressures of growing towns, rising population, and the slow spread of manufacturing ideas, early experiments with warm air ducts in a few progressive mills and hospitals, hinted that the old reliance on a single, carefully guarded flame might one day be joined by something more distributed, more constant. For now, though, the inheritance held firm. Warmth remained a daily achievement, coaxed from coal and iron and human care, one firelit evening at a time, as families across the island settled into the long winter nights with the quiet knowledge that survival and comfort had always been, and for a while longer would remain, inseparable from the steady glow at the center of the room. The 19th century, with its accelerating pace of industrial life and expanding networks of canals and railways, began to loosen that bond in ways that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. Yet the older rhythms of fire tending endured in countless households long after the first factories had filled the skies with smoke. In the new mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, where rows of back-to-back terraces sprang up beside the cotton mills, coal was suddenly abundant and cheap, delivered straight to the cellar by the cartload. The iron range, now a common fixture in the tiny kitchens, replaced the open hearth for many working families. Its closed firebox and built-in oven allowed a single fire to simmer soup, bake bread, and warm the room without the constant draft that had once whistled across medieval floors. Housewives learned to manage the damper and flue with the same quiet precision their ancestors had used for the curfew stone, banking the coals at night so that a core of heat would still be waiting when the shift whistle blew before dawn. The air inside these small dwellings grew drier and warmer than it had in the days of peat and thatch, yet the shared walls of the terraces carried sound as readily as heat, and on winter evenings the low murmur of neighboring fires blended with the distant clatter of mill machinery, creating a new kind of domestic soundscape that felt both comforting and strangely industrial. In the countryside, the older patterns held longer, softened only by the steady trickle of improved transport. A Hampshire farmer might still cook over an open hearth in the kitchen where the family gathered, its wide chimney drawing smoke from seasoned beech logs cut on the estate's own coppice, while a small coal grate in the parlor, reserved for Sundays and visitors, offered a more refined warmth for reading or mending. The Rumford principles had spread further by the 1820s and 1830s, with angled firebacks and narrowed throats appearing even in modest farmhouses, reflecting heat forward so efficiently that a single load of coal could warm the room through the longest evening without the old wasteful roar. Bedchambers, often unheated, still relied on warming pans carried upstairs at bedtime, their long wooden handles clinking softly on the stairs as a servant or elder daughter made the rounds. Frost still gathered on the window panes, and the passages between rooms remained chill enough that families moved through the house wrapped in shawls and waistcoats, just as their medieval forebears had drawn cloaks closer against the drafts. The inheritance was visible in small, unremarked habits: the careful raking of embers, the placement of a low stool within the radiant arc, the shared understanding that warmth was something earned rather than assumed. Yet the very abundance of coal carried subtle contradictions that would have felt familiar to any 14th-century householder who had watched sparks threaten the thatch. In the industrial cities, the combined smoke of thousands of ranges and grates thickened the winter air into the notorious pea soupers, their yellow-brown fog so dense that street lamps burned at midday and respiratory ailments filled the new hospitals. Families who could afford it installed register grates with sliding plates that allowed precise control of the draft, reducing soot and improving efficiency, but the poorer terraces often made do with older, inefficient fireplaces whose smoke leaked back into the room on windy nights. The contrast between classes sharpened. In the Grand Regency and early Victorian villas of Mayfair or Bath, Marble chimney pieces and ornate cast-iron grates created pockets of luxurious warmth where ladies could sit in light muslin without shivering, while in the cellars and attics of the same houses servants still huddled around the kitchen range or a single brazier, their shared body heat echoing the medieval practice of clustering together for survival. Physicians, now writing in English rather than Latin, warned of the dangers of vitiated air from coal smoke and advised the wealthy to keep nurseries well away from the main chimneys. Yet the practical reality for most remained the same quiet negotiation with fuel and flame. Architectural fashions of the period continued to refine the medieval shell while preserving its essential logic. The terraced houses built for the expanding middle classes featured 2 or even 3 fireplaces per dwelling, allowing the family to withdraw to a comfortable parlor after supper. The kitchen range left to simmer overnight under a low fire. Sash windows, fitted more tightly than before, still admitted drafts at the edges, so householders used embroidered draft excluders or rolled blankets at the sills, much as earlier generations had stuffed rags into shutter gaps. In the great country houses of the landed gentry, the staterooms boasted elaborate grates with polished steel fenders and firebacks decorated with classical scenes. Yet the servants' quarters and the long corridors relied on the residual warmth that rose from below or on the occasional brazier carried by a footman. The kitchen remained the true heart of the house, its range or open hearth providing both sustenance and a steady background heat that drew everyone together at the end of the day, echoing the way medieval families had once gathered around the central fire for stories and shared warmth. Regional differences persisted with quiet stubbornness. In the coal-rich northeast, the range was often a generous affair with multiple ovens and a boiler for constant hot water, its heat shared freely with neighbors during hard frosts. In the southwest, where peat and wood still held sway in remoter districts, the open hearth lingered, its smoke curling toward chimneys that had been raised and lined with fireclay but whose purpose had changed little since the 15th century. In Scotland, the box bed endured in many farmhouses, its heavy curtains and stone shelves for hot bricks turning each sleeping alcove into a private defense against the Highland winds, while in Ireland and Wales the turf fire on the floor of the cabin remained a living link to older traditions, its slow smolder filling the single room with a gentle, aromatic haze. Everywhere the evening ritual adapted but never vanished. Coals or turf raked together, the damper closed or the ash drawn forward, a final check that the fire would hold until morning. Children still learned to coax the first flames of the day with dry kindling and careful breath, the same small domestic act that had once been performed beside wattle and daub walls centuries earlier. As the Victorian age gathered momentum and the railways carried coal to every corner of the kingdom, these accumulated layers of refinement stood poised to absorb yet another wave of innovation. The first closed stoves, imported from the continent or manufactured in Birmingham foundries, appeared in a few progressive kitchens, promising even greater control over heat and smoke, while gas lighting, first in the streets and then in wealthier homes, hinted at a future where warmth might one day be separated from flame altogether. For the great majority, however, the steady glow at the center of the room remained the unchanging constant, a living inheritance that linked the mill worker's terrace to the medieval cottage in an unbroken chain of quiet ingenuity. New agricultural machinery and factory textiles made layering against the cold easier and more varied. Yet the fundamental challenge of the English winter refused to yield entirely. Joints still ached after years of damp and cold. The very young and the very old still gathered closest to the fire, and the shared understanding that comfort was never guaranteed but had to be coaxed, guarded, and passed on endured as strongly as ever. And as the century moved deeper into its middle years, with the slow spread of municipal gas supplies and the first tentative experiments with hot water pipes in hospitals and large institutions, the medieval house, now dressed in Victorian brick and iron, would face fresh tests and fresh opportunities once again, its hearths and ranges quietly preparing to meet a world that was beginning, at long last, to imagine warmth without the constant presence of an open flame by the closing decades of the 19th century, the steady advance of municipal gas supplies and the first practical experiments with hot water circulation began to loosen the ancient grip of the open fire. Yet for the great majority of English households, the familiar rituals of coal and grate remained the unchanging center of winter life. In the expanding suburbs of London and the industrial cities, gas pipes reached row after row of terraced houses, bringing not only brighter evening light but the possibility of gas fires fitted into the old iron grates. These new burners hissed softly behind decorative ceramic elements, producing a clean, even heat that required no banking at night and left no ash to sweep in the morning. A middle-class family could now turn a small valve and feel warmth spread across the parlor within minutes. A convenience that would have seemed almost magical to a 14th-century cottager kneeling to coax embers at dawn. Yet the older inheritance persisted in subtle ways. The gas fire still needed careful tending to prevent the pilot from extinguishing, and many households kept a small coal range in the kitchen for cooking and for the deeper, more comforting warmth it gave off when the damper was opened wide. The air in these rooms grew drier and less smoky, allowing wallpaper to stay brighter and curtains to remain fresh for longer. But on particularly cold nights, families still drew their chairs closer to the grate out of long habit, the same instinctive huddle that had once formed around a medieval hearth. In the countryside and among the working poor, the transition was slower and more uneven. A Dorset farm laborer's cottage might still rely on a broad open range that burned a mix of coal and wood hauled from the nearest station, its oven door left ajar in the evenings to release gentle waves of heat while bread rose for the next day. The daily round of fire tending followed the same quiet choreography it had for centuries. Ashes raked forward at bedtime, the damper adjusted just so, a final check that the coals would hold their glow until the first stirring before the men left for the fields. Hot water bottles of stoneware or rubber replaced the old iron boxes, their warmth lasting longer and leaking less, yet they were still carried upstairs by the same careful hands that had once wrapped river stones in flannel. Frost continued to form delicate patterns on single-glazed windows, and the narrow passages between rooms stayed cold enough that a quick dash to the privy or the coal shed required an extra layer of shawl or jacket. Physicians of the period, writing in popular magazines rather than dusty treatises, continued to recommend keeping the very young and the elderly within easy reach of the fire, advice that echoed the medieval concern for the vulnerable without anyone noticing the unbroken thread. The grander houses of the late Victorian and Edwardian gentry displayed these changes on a more ambitious scale. In country estates and new town mansions, the first closed stoves and early central heating systems appeared, often hidden behind ornate grills in the hallways or concealed in basements where boilers fed hot water through iron pipes to radiators in the principal rooms. A wealthy family could now retire to a bedroom that stayed tolerably warm through the night without the labor of carrying warming pans or banking multiple grates, and the morning routine no longer began with a servant kneeling at the hearth in every chamber. Yet even here the medieval echo lingered. Many households kept at least one open coal fire in the drawing room for its cheerful flicker and the way it drew people together after dinner. The same social magnetism that had once centered medieval life around a single smoky blaze. Servants still slept in attics or basements where the new pipes brought only modest warmth, their bodies clustered for comfort much as they had in earlier centuries, while the family enjoyed the novelty of rising to a house that felt less like a collection of separate hearths and more like a single, gently heated whole. The contrast between the polished comfort of the upstairs rooms and the chill of the service quarters remained a daily fact, accepted with the same practical resignation that earlier generations had shown toward drafts and damp. Gas and hot water brought their own quiet ironies. The convenience of a turnkey fire was offset by the occasional leak of unburned gas that could leave a faint metallic taste in the air or, far more dangerously, lead to explosions that reminded everyone how new technology still carried old risks. In the terraced streets of Manchester or Birmingham, a blocked flue or a faulty burner could fill a small parlor with invisible poison, prompting landlords to issue stern notices about ventilation that would have been familiar to any Tudor householder worried about smoke backing down the chimney. The very efficiency of the new systems encouraged larger rooms and higher ceilings in the middle-class homes, Yet those same spaces still lost heat upward through poorly insulated roofs, and on the coldest nights families found themselves unconsciously drifting back toward the kitchen range where the residual warmth from cooking lingered longest. Regional patterns endured with quiet stubbornness. In the coal-rich northeast, the kitchen range remained a generous, multi-oven affair that could heat water for baths and keep the house dry even in the worst fogs, while in the southwest the turf fire on the cottage floor continued to smolder gently, its aromatic haze filling the single room in a direct line of descent from the peat fires of the 15th century. Across every level of society, the shared domestic knowledge deepened its quiet authority. People still judged the quality of a winter's supply by the weight and color of each delivery, still arranged furniture to shield against drafts, still layered clothing that could be added or shed as the heat rose or fell. The evening ritual adapted but never vanished. A valve turned or a damper closed, the faint hiss of gas or the soft clink of coals settling, a final check that the house would hold its warmth until morning. Children learned to strike a match or adjust a pilot light with the same careful attention once given to blowing on embers, the small domestic sacrament unchanged in spirit even as its outward form evolved. In the great public buildings, hospitals, schools, and the new town halls, central heating began to spread, promising a future in which entire institutions could be kept at an even temperature without the labor of countless individual fires. Yet private homes clung to the older ways with a stubborn affection born of generations of lived experience. As the Edwardian age gave way to the uncertainties of the early 20th century and the gathering clouds of global conflict, these accumulated layers of refinement stood poised to absorb yet another wave of pressure. The demands of war would soon ration coal and redirect gas supplies, forcing many households to revive the old arts of careful banking and shared body heat. While the slow spread of electricity in the 1920s and 1930s hinted at a future in which warmth might finally be summoned by the flick of a switch rather than the steady tending of flame. For now, though, the medieval house, transformed beyond recognition yet still warmed at its core by the same patient ingenuity, continued its quiet negotiation with the English winter. The inheritance remained alive in every home that kept a fire, however modern its surround, and the lived reality of staying warm still turned on the small, daily acts of attention that linked the mill worker's kitchen range to the wattle and daub hearth of half a millennium earlier. And as the new century unfolded with its wars, its economic shifts, and its accelerating technological promise, those same households would be called upon once more to adapt the ancient domestic science to circumstances no one inside those familiar walls could yet fully foresee. The First World War brought those circumstances sharply into focus, as coal shipments from the northeast were diverted to the war effort and gas supplies were rationed to conserve resources for munitions factories. In the terraced streets of industrial towns and the cottages of the countryside alike, families rediscovered the patient arts their grandparents had known. The careful banking of a smaller fire, the stretching of each delivery by mixing in whatever peat, wood scraps, or even dried garden waste could be found. Housewives who had grown accustomed to turning a valve on a gas ring now learned once more to rake embers forward at night and rise before dawn to coax them back to life, their breath visible in the cold air of unheated bedrooms. Hot water bottles and stoneware pigs returned to nightly service, passed from bed to bed in the same quiet rotation that had once warmed medieval palates. The shared body heat of children tucked between parents or siblings became a practical necessity again rather than a nostalgic memory. And in the kitchens the range, whether coal or the last of the gas models, burned lower and longer, its oven door left ajar to release gentle waves that warmed the whole downstairs room. The medieval inheritance, dormant beneath layers of Edwardian convenience, reasserted itself with a quiet insistence that felt both reassuring and sobering. The interwar years brought a fragile return to abundance, but the lessons of scarcity lingered in household habits. Council houses built for returning soldiers often featured improved fireplaces with better drafted flues and, in the more progressive schemes, small back boilers that heated water for a modest bathroom or scullery. Yet many families still kept a coal scuttle beside the grate and a poker within easy reach, the the same tools that had served for centuries, because the new electric fires, gleaming chrome bars that glowed orange when switched on, were expensive to run and sometimes unreliable when the supply faltered. In the suburbs, the first electric storage heaters appeared in a few forward-looking homes, storing heat in heavy clay bricks during cheap nighttime hours and releasing it slowly through the day, a distant cousin of the medieval practice of warming stones in the embers. Still, on winter evenings the living room fire remained the gathering point, its flicker drawing families together for wireless broadcasts or simple conversation in a way that no radiator could quite replicate. The contrast between the steady, silent warmth of new technology and the living, breathing presence of an open fire echoed the old tension between efficiency and the deep human comfort of a visible flame. The Second World War tested the domestic science even more severely. Ration books limited coal to a few hundredweight per household each month, and gas and electricity were strictly metered. Blackout curtains, heavy and tightly fitted, served the double purpose of hiding light from enemy bombers and sealing drafts more effectively than any Victorian valance. Families revived the wartime habit of one-room living, crowding into the kitchen or parlor where a single low fire could warm everyone at once, much as medieval households had once huddled in a single smoky hall. Children collected kindling on their way home from school, and neighbors traded small sacks of coke or anthracite when one household ran short. Hot water bottles were filled from the kettle on the range rather than from a boiler, and beds were warmed with newspaper layers slipped between blankets, an old trick updated for new shortages. The very young and the elderly were still guided closest to the hearth, their stools placed in the precise arc of greatest heat, while the rest of the family layered clothing and moved quickly through the colder passages. The ancient knowledge proved resilient. A well-banked fire could hold its glow until morning even on the strictest ration, and the shared understanding that warmth was something earned and guarded together returned with an almost instinctive familiarity. Peace in 1945 brought renewed building and the slow spread of modern heating, yet the transition was gradual and uneven. New council estates of the late 1940s and 1950s often featured solid fuel ranges or the first gas fires with decorative ceramic radiance, but many older terraces and rural cottages kept their open grates well into the 1960s. Central heating, when it arrived, first in the form of oil-fired boilers in larger homes, then gas-fired systems in the expanding suburbs, promised an end to the daily labor of fire tending. Radiators could be left on low overnight, filling rooms with an even, dry warmth that required no banking and produced no ash. Yet the older generation noticed that the new systems lacked the cheerful flicker that had once drawn families together, and many households retained at least one open fire or gas fire for evenings when the television was off and conversation mattered more than convenience. Electric blankets and underfloor heating in a few experimental houses echoed the medieval use of hot stones or the monastic kale factory, distributing warmth more evenly yet still relying on the same fundamental principle, capturing and holding heat against the persistent chill of the English winter. By the 1970s and 1980s, the domestic landscape had shifted again under the pressures of oil crises and the widespread adoption of natural gas. Double glazing and loft insulation began to appear in ordinary homes, reducing the drafts that had once whistled through single-pane windows and thick stone walls. Central heating thermostats allowed precise control, yet the old rituals survived in small, affectionate ways. A favorite chair still positioned near the living room radiator on the coldest nights, a hot water bottle kept in the airing cupboard for guests or for the occasional power cut. In the countryside, older farmhouses, now modernized with oil or gas boilers, sometimes retained their original inglenook fireplaces as decorative features, their wide chimneys capped but still carrying the faint scent of wood smoke when the wind turned. The medieval house had been transformed, thick walls now hidden behind plasterboard, thatch replaced by tile or slate, open hearths by sleek radiators. Yet the lived experience of winter retained its quiet continuity. Families still judged a house's comfort by how evenly the warmth reached the farthest corners, still layered clothing against sudden cold spells, still gathered instinctively where the heat felt strongest. The closing decades of the 20th century brought yet another layer of refinement and reflection. Heat pumps and condensing boilers promised greater efficiency, while solar panels on some rooftops hinted at warmth drawn not from coal seams but from the sun itself. Yet even in these technologically sophisticated homes, the ancient domestic science lingered in subtle forms. Programmable thermostats that mimicked the careful banking of a fire, underfloor heating that recalled the Roman hypocausts known to medieval monks, and the persistent human habit of drawing closer together on the coldest evenings regardless of how evenly the radiators glowed. The very young and the elderly were still guided toward the warmest spots, and the shared body heat of a family under one roof remained a quiet comfort when the power failed or the boiler needed repair. Regional differences, though softened by national supply chains, continued to color daily life. A terraced house in Newcastle with its efficient gas combi boiler felt worlds apart from a remote Welsh cottage still warmed by a wood-burning stove on long winter nights. Yet both were part of the same unbroken thread of adaptation. As the new millennium approached, those same households stood on the threshold of changes driven by climate awareness and digital control, where smart thermostats and insulated building regulations promised to rewrite the rules of domestic warmth once more. The medieval inheritance, now buried beneath layers of technology and regulation, remained alive in the small, instinctive acts of attention that no algorithm could fully replace. The placement of a chair, the layering of a blanket, the quiet recognition that comfort in the long English winter had always been, and perhaps would always remain, a daily negotiation between people, their houses, and the cold outside the door. That quiet recognition that comfort in the long English winter had always been, and perhaps would always remain, a daily negotiation between people, their houses, and the cold outside the door found new expression as the new millennium unfolded and digital technology began to weave itself into the very fabric of domestic warmth. In the early years of the 2000s, smart thermostats appeared in increasing numbers of homes, small devices that learned the rhythms of a household's day and adjusted the flow of hot water through radiators or underfloor pipes with a precision no medieval fire tender could have imagined. A family in a suburban semi-detached house could now program warmth to greet them when they returned from work, the radiators clicking softly to life an hour before the front door opened. Yet many still kept a favorite armchair positioned exactly where the heat felt strongest, an instinctive echo of the old placement of stools within the radiant arc of a hearth. Loft insulation thickened, double glazing became standard in new builds, and cavity walls were filled with foam or mineral wool, all in the name of efficiency. Yet the older houses, those thick-walled Victorian terraces or stone farm cottages, still held their chill in the bones during sudden cold snaps, reminding their owners that no amount of modern regulation could entirely erase the medieval truth that a building's fabric mattered as much as its fuel. The financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent years of austerity sharpened these negotiations once more. Rising energy bills prompted many households to revive older habits. Layering extra blankets on beds rather than turning the thermostat higher, closing off unused rooms to concentrate warmth in the spaces where people actually lived, much as medieval families had once drawn curtains around a single bed in a larger hall. Wood-burning stoves enjoyed a quiet renaissance in both rural and urban homes, their glass doors offering a visible flame that drew families together on winter evenings in a way that silent radiators never quite could. The stoves were cleaner and more efficient than any open medieval hearth, with catalytic converters and precise air controls. Yet the ritual of laying the fire, choosing seasoned logs, arranging kindling, striking the match, felt reassuringly familiar, a direct line back to the patient tending of embers that had once been the first task of every dawn. In the countryside especially, households that had converted old inglenooks into modern stoves found themselves rediscovering the satisfaction of managing their own fuel supply, stacking logs under cover through the summer and judging the quality of each delivery by weight and dryness, the same quiet domestic arithmetic that had sustained yeomen through the 15th century. Climate awareness added another layer to the story. By the 2010s, government incentives for renewable energy encouraged the installation of air source heat pumps in new and retrofitted homes, machines that drew warmth from the outside air even on frosty mornings and delivered it through underfloor pipes or low-temperature radiators. These systems echoed the monastic kale factories of old, circulating gentle heat beneath floors or along walls rather than relying on a single blazing fire, yet they required careful management. A poorly insulated house could still feel drafty at the edges, and during the coldest spells the pumps worked harder, their fans humming softly in the garden, while the indoor temperature held steady at a level that would have astonished a Tudor merchant. Families learned new rhythms, programming the system to run at lower temperatures for longer periods rather than blasting heat in short bursts, a strategy that mirrored the medieval practice of banking coals for endurance rather than letting them roar wastefully. In social housing and older private homes, grants for external wall insulation and triple glazing began to transform the look of streets. Yet the lived experience inside often retained its quiet continuity. Children still tucked between parents on the coldest nights, elderly relatives still guided to the warmest chair, the shared understanding that warmth was something to be guarded collectively rather than taken for granted. The energy crises of the early 2020s, triggered by geopolitical tensions and supply disruptions, brought the medieval inheritance into sharper relief than perhaps any decade since the World Wars. Households across the country turned down thermostats by a degree or two, layered clothing more deliberately, and in some cases dusted off portable electric heaters or even small wood stoves for backup during price spikes. Power cuts, though rare, prompted a return to candles and hot water bottles, the same portable warmth that had once traveled from hearth to bed in iron boxes or wrapped stones. Online communities shared tips for draft-proofing windows with old blankets or thermal curtains, advice that would have been instantly recognizable to a Stuart housewife stuffing rags into shutter gaps. Yet the technology of the age offered new tools: smart meters that displayed real-time consumption, apps that suggested the most economical times to run the heating, and community schemes that pooled resources for bulk fuel deliveries. The contrast was striking. Medieval families had managed with a single fire and collective ingenuity. Modern ones balanced algorithms and renewables with the same underlying need to negotiate the cold. In the years that followed, the push toward net-zero homes accelerated the quiet evolution. New-build properties incorporated passive solar design, thick insulation, and mechanical ventilation systems that recovered heat from outgoing air, creating dwellings that stayed warm with remarkably little energy input. Older houses underwent deep retrofits, external insulation rendering them almost unrecognizable beneath fresh cladding, heat pumps replacing gas boilers, and battery storage capturing surplus solar power for evening use. Yet even in these cutting-edge homes the human element endured. Families still gathered where the warmth felt most inviting, whether around a low-background underfloor system or beside a modern wood burner whose flames flickered behind glass. The very young learned, through school projects or family stories, how their ancestors had once coaxed life from a single flame, and the elderly spoke of winters when a well-banked fire was the difference between comfort and hardship, their memories bridging centuries in the space of a fireside conversation. Regional and social differences continued to shape the experience in subtle ways. A terraced house in a former mill town, now fitted with a communal district heating network, enjoyed steady warmth piped from a central plant running on biomass or waste heat, while a remote Highland croft relied on a wood pellet stove and thick stone walls that held the day's solar gain long into the night. In cities, high-rise apartments with underfloor heating felt worlds apart from the single-room flats where portable heaters still supplemented inadequate central systems. Yet in every case the negotiation remained personal and daily. The placement of furniture, the layering of textiles, the instinctive drift toward the warmest spot as evening deepened. The medieval house, transformed beyond recognition by regulation, technology, and environmental imperative, still whispered its lessons through the walls. Warmth was never a right but a relationship, built on attention, adaptation, and the quiet knowledge that the cold outside the door would always test the ingenuity inside. As the 2020s gave way to the 2030s and beyond, those same households found themselves standing at the edge of yet another threshold. Advances in material science promised phase-change materials that could store and release heat like the old warming stones but on an industrial scale, while community energy projects and smart grids hinted at a future in which warmth might be shared across neighborhoods as readily as medieval villagers had once shared the glow of a single hearth. The ancient domestic science, now encoded in algorithms and insulation standards, continued its patient evolution, carrying forward the lived wisdom of generations who had learned, through frost and firelight, exactly what it took to keep a home alive through the long English winter. In the decades that followed the 2030s, as climate patterns grew more unpredictable and energy systems shifted toward renewables, English households found themselves once again negotiating the cold with a blend of ancient patience and cutting-edge ingenuity that would have felt strangely familiar to a medieval yeoman. Heat pumps, now standard in both new builds and retrofitted older properties, drew warmth from the air or the ground even on damp February mornings, circulating it through underfloor pipes or low-profile radiators that hummed almost silently. Families learned to trust the steady, even warmth these systems provided, yet many still kept a wool throw draped over the back of a sofa or positioned a favorite chair where the radiant heat from the floor felt strongest, an instinctive echo of the way ancestors had once arranged stools in the arc of a hearth. Smart home systems adjusted temperatures based on occupancy sensors and weather forecasts, banking heat during off-peak hours the way a careful housekeeper had once drawn ash over coals, ensuring that when the household stirred at dawn the rooms were already gently warm without waste. Yet on those occasional still, frosty nights when the grid strained or a storm knocked out power for a few hours, households reached for the old portable solutions. Hot water bottles filled from the kettle, extra blankets layered on beds, bodies huddled closer together in the living room. Reminders that no technology had fully erased the need for collective resourcefulness. The push toward net zero living brought its own quiet ironies and deeper layers of adaptation. New passive houses, built with super-insulated walls and triple-glazed windows that captured every scrap of winter sunlight, stayed warm with almost no active heating at all, their thick fabric holding the day's solar gain long into the evening, much as medieval stone walls had once radiated stored chill back into a room. Families who moved into these homes spoke of the strange comfort of a house that felt alive with its own thermal mass, yet many confessed to missing the visible flicker of a flame and deliberately installed a small wood stove or bioethanol fire as a decorative and emotional centerpiece. In older cottages and terraces, deep energy retrofits added external wall insulation that transformed the look of entire streets. Yet inside the thick original walls still carried the memory of damp and draft, requiring careful ventilation to prevent the condensation that had once formed on medieval daub. Community heat networks, fed by biomass plants or captured industrial waste heat, piped warmth to whole neighborhoods from a single efficient source, echoing the way monastic kale factories had once served an entire community from one carefully tended fire. Residents learned to schedule their days around the network's rhythms, much as earlier generations had planned around the availability of peat or coal, and neighborhood apps allowed neighbors to share surplus solar power or coordinate bulk deliveries of logs for backup stoves. Regional differences persisted with the same stubborn clarity they had shown across the centuries. In the coal-scarred Northeast, where district heating now warmed rows of former pit houses, the old kitchen range had often been replaced by sleek induction hobs, yet many households kept a small solid-fuel burner for the psychological comfort of a visible glow during long winter evenings. In the Southwest, where wind and rain swept across the moors, off-grid homes relied on wood pellet boilers and thick thatch-style insulation on roofs, their owners stacking seasoned timber under cover each autumn with the same deliberate care a 15th-century farmer had shown his coppice. Scottish crofts and Welsh farmsteads embraced air-source heat pumps supplemented by underfloor heating laid over the original flagstones, the systems whispering warmth through spaces that had once been shared with livestock for their collective body heat. In London's Victorian terraces, retrofitted with internal insulation and smart controls, families still felt the subtle temperature gradient between floors, the upstairs rooms cooler by a few degrees in the old way, prompting the same evening migration downstairs that medieval households had known when the single hall fire was the only source of comfort. Social and economic pressures continued to test these modern domestic negotiations. Rising living costs in the 2040s prompted many to revive wartime-style one-room living, closing off less-used spaces and concentrating warmth where it mattered most. A practical choice that mirrored the medieval instinct to draw curtains around a bed or gather everyone close to the central hearth. Community warmth hubs, shared heated spaces in libraries or former pubs, emerged in some towns, offering a place for the elderly or those in fuel poverty to spend an evening in genuine comfort. Much as medieval villagers had once relied on the collective glow of neighboring fires or the hospitality of the manor hall. Schools and workplaces incorporated lessons on thermal efficiency drawn from historical examples, teaching children how their ancestors had banked fires and layered clothing, fostering a new generation that understood warmth not as an automatic background condition but as something shaped by daily choices. The very young still sought the warmest corners instinctively, and the elderly were still guided toward the most comfortable chair, their shared stories bridging the gap between the flickering medieval hearth and the quiet hum of a heat pump. As the middle decades of the 21st century unfolded, innovations in materials and systems promised even greater control while quietly honoring the past. Phase-change materials embedded in walls and ceilings absorbed excess heat during the day and released it at night, functioning like vastly scaled-up versions of the warming stones once heated in embers and wrapped in cloth. Smart windows that tinted automatically or generated their own warmth through embedded films reduced the old battle against drafts, yet many homeowners still hung heavy curtains for the tactile reassurance they provided, the fabric evoking the tapestries that had once insulated stone manor houses. Electric blankets and heated mattress pads, now controlled by voice or app, offered localized warmth that recalled the portable braziers carried from room to room in Tudor times, while community energy cooperatives allowed households to trade surplus power from solar panels or small wind turbines, turning individual homes into nodes in a larger, shared thermal network reminiscent of the way medieval monasteries had distributed warmth from a single kale factory. The lived experience of staying warm, for all its technological refinement, retained its deeply human core. Families still arranged their evenings around the subtle gradients of heat in their homes, still judged a winter's comfort by how evenly warmth reached the farthest corners, still gathered where the temperature felt most inviting when conversation or quiet reflection mattered more than efficiency. The ancient domestic science had not been replaced. It had been layered and encoded, its patient wisdom now flowing through algorithms and insulation, sensors and renewables, yet always returning to the same fundamental truth that had sustained English households for more than 6 centuries. Comfort in the face of winter was never guaranteed but had to be coaxed, guarded, and passed on through small, thoughtful acts of attention. And as the century moved deeper into its later years, with new pressures from shifting climate patterns and evolving energy landscapes already beginning to reshape the built environment once more, those same households would be called upon to adapt again, carrying the medieval inheritance forward into futures that no one inside those increasingly efficient walls could yet fully imagine. And yet, as those futures begin to take shape around us, the medieval inheritance remains quietly present in every home, a living thread that binds the present to a past that feels both distant and intimately familiar. From the narrow, smoke-filled cottages of the 14th century, where families banked embers beneath a simple curfew and shared body heat beneath woolen curtains, to the algorithm-guided, super-insulated dwellings of our own time, the story of staying warm has never been one of simple progress or effortless comfort. It has always been a patient negotiation, shaped by the thickness of walls, the quality of fuel, the ingenuity of small daily acts, and the shared understanding that cold is not merely weather but a force that tests the bonds between people and the places they call home. We began our journey stepping across the threshold of an ordinary medieval house around the year 1350, feeling the bite of draughts through wattle and daub, the sting of wood smoke in the eyes, and the quiet determination required to keep a single flame alive until morning. What seemed at first like unrelenting hardship revealed itself, layer by layer, as a sophisticated domestic science. The careful placement of beds to capture rising heat, the strategic use of animals for shared warmth, the seasonal rhythms of fuel gathering and storage, the architectural innovations that slowly drew smoke away and allowed privacy without sacrificing survival. We watched that science evolve through plague and war, enclosure and enclosure, the slow creep of chimneys and coal, the industrial abundance of gas and electricity, and the climate-driven refinements of our own century. Yet at every turn the core truth endured. Warmth was never a right granted by walls or wealth. It was earned, guarded, and passed from one generation to the next through attention, adaptation, and the quiet acknowledgement that comfort is always partial, always temporary, always collective. That recognition carries a gentle resonance even now. In an age of thermostats and heat pumps, we may no longer kneel to blow on embers or carry hot stones to bed. Yet we still feel the same instinctive pull toward the warmest corner of a room, still layer blankets on the coldest nights, still gather closer to one another when the power flickers or the wind howls. The medieval house, for all its apparent simplicity, taught a lesson that no amount of technology has rendered obsolete. The English winter has always demanded respect, and the people who lived through it met that demand not with grand declarations but with small, practical wisdom stored in muscle memory and family lore. Their struggles remind us that every degree of comfort we enjoy today rests on centuries of patient trial and error, on lives lived in the half-light of open hearths where survival and intimacy were inseparable. As you listen to these final words and feel the quiet pull of sleep, perhaps you find yourself noticing the temperature of your own room with a slightly different awareness. The soft gradient between floor and ceiling, the way a blanket settles across your shoulders, the faint comfort of knowing that warmth, however it is produced, is still something we tend with care. It is a small bridge across time, a reminder that the men, women, and children who once huddled around smoky fires in wattle and daub cottages were not so very different from us in their hopes for a night without shivering, their satisfaction in a well-laid fire, and their gratitude for the simple fact of being warm together. I wonder what detail from these long centuries of keeping warm lingered with you the most. The smoky intimacy of a single-room medieval hall, the patient ritual of banking coals at dusk, or the way modern efficiency still echoes those ancient acts of attention. Perhaps it has shifted, ever so slightly, the way you experience the temperature in your own home tonight. If these calm, thoughtful journeys into the past have offered you a gentle place to rest your mind, I hope you will find your way back to us soon for another long, immersive exploration of history. Until then, rest deeply, stay warm, and know that the quiet science of comfort continues, just as it has for more than 600 years. Good night.